adaptation strategies for key Southern California habitat. My name is Jessie Kirshner. I'm a senior scientist with EcoAdapt, and I'm going to be both presenting and moderating this webinar. Before we get started, I just wanted to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. We have 1 hour scheduled for the webinar. So first we're going to be having a 45-minute presentation by Sarah Sawyer, who's the regional wildlife ecologist, and then myself, Whitney Rainier, and Laura Hilberg with EcoAdapt. And following the presentation, we're going to have about 15 minutes for participants to ask questions about the presentation or project, how products can be used. And the webinar is meant to introduce Forest Service staff to the vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy process and the products. If you participated in any of these, it's just meant to share with you all of the different products that we've created and spend a little bit of time talking about how they can be used in management and planning. You are welcome to submit questions or comments in writing during the presentation. As I mentioned, you should have a control panel where you have a couple of drop-down menus for questions or a chat box. So if you're having any issues, please let us know. Or if you want to ask any questions, go ahead and write them in. We will be holding all questions until the end of the presentation. And we would prefer if you would submit written questions just so we don't have to go through the unmuting issue where there could be a lot of background noise. But if you'd rather ask a question, you can also use the raise your hand function, and then I can unmute you at the end of the presentation. The webinar is also being recorded, and I will be sending out an email with a link to view the recording of the webinar as well as the PDF of the presentation. So it's going to be posted on our project website as well, which is this website here in the dark blue box at the bottom. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Sawyer to talk a little bit about the project and give an overview.
Great. Thanks, Jessie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So as Jessie mentioned, our goal here really is to let everybody know what products are now available and how they can be used for you all as we wrap up this project. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background on how the project got started, and I am sure that many of you participated along the way. We originally started this partnership with EcoAdapt, which is a climate adaptation focused NGO in the Sierra Nevada, and the impetus was largely to meet our climate change scorecard goals, and you can see the climate scorecard there on the right of that slide, and a lot of them are tied up in projects like this, things like engagement with scientists and other partners, assessing vulnerability, developing adaptation strategies, as well as developing some monitoring programs and even, employee education. And as you all probably know, the climate change performance scorecard has now gone away, but we think that whatever the next round ends up being after all the conversations are concluded is going to be very similar. And so these are, whether or not we have a scorecard to tell us we need to do these things, these kind of are our foundational climate change goals for the agency. And so we developed the project to address those issues, and then for the Sierra Nevada, of course, forest plan revision was very important. And as we were wrapping up in the Sierra Nevada, we had a lot of successes and we had a lot of interest, and so we decided the next round should go to Southern California. And even though you guys aren't due for plan revision for quite a while, you have been going through the monitoring program transition, so that we were hoping to also address in this project. The other thing, of course, is project planning in NEPA. So, of course, there's been guidance from CQ recently that we do need to address climate change in all of our project planning. How that pans out again in the current conversations, we shall see, but more and more stakeholders are asking, and we see this in comments all the time, especially on DEIS, is how are you incorporating climate change into this project? And so we really wanted to provide some foundational documents and products that could make it quite easy for anybody in the Forest Service to just grab something as they're developing a project, as they're having conversations with stakeholders, that could show what we are doing to address climate change and how we can incorporate it into our everyday lives. And then the last aspect, of course, is that one of the main benefits of these types of projects is the workshops and the partnerships and the relationships that are formed. We had a lot of feedback along the way that folks are really appreciative just to get in a room with some of our stakeholders and our partners and talk about what we're all doing and what we all hope to do focused around climate change. So that was kind of the impetus for the project, and we partnered with EcoAdapt. They're a great partner, and they're going to tell you quite a bit more about the process, but especially about the products, and then we can talk more during question and answer about how they can be used in the future.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So I wanted to give everyone sort of a broad scale overview of the climate smart planning process, which is what we followed as part of this particular project. The first step over here is to define goals and identify your priorities. So in this particular project, it was identifying focal resources and really looking at habitats, and then you assess their vulnerability to climate change by looking at sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Then you move on to identifying adaptation strategies and actions. Basically, what are ways that we can reduce those vulnerabilities that have been identified and increase the resilience of our resources. And then, of course, implementing those adaptation options. So where can we make changes in management? Where can we enhance cooperation and coordination among organizations in order to put some of these adaptation options into practice, and then monitoring, reviewing, and revising. So this is sort of generally the process that we went through as part of this project. But more specifically, our project methodology was really divided into two phases. The first phase is focused on the vulnerability assessment. So the first step of that was to identify the focal resources, what we really wanted to look at for the remainder of the project, and then to gather relevant data and information. And then the second step was to assess the vulnerability of those resources to climate change. The second phase was focused entirely on adaptation planning. So we held an adaptation workshop where we applied the vulnerability assessment results in order to develop adaptation strategies and actions for the resources that we looked at. And then we held another adaptation workshop where we really tried to focus in on specific management activities in Southern California and develop out adaptation implementation plans for on-the-ground action. So what are some of the things that we can be doing now or can be incorporating into future projects so that we're really thinking about climate vulnerability and thinking about adaptation. So the first step was to identify these priorities or these focal resources. The goal was to collaboratively identify regionally important resources, things like habitats, species or species groups, and ecosystem services. So to complete this step, we formed a stakeholder working group. It was about 25 different folks from state and federal agencies, universities, NGOs, other folks in the region. And this particular group initially worked together to identify a draft list of habitat types for Southern California. That was just sort of to get the process and the thought process going. And then we held a focal resources workshop, and we had some resource selection guidance that went along at that workshop in order to finalize a list of resources. So at that particular workshop, we had people think about regionally important habitats, species, and ecosystem services. But in the end, we decided to focus in on focal habitats, and this is primarily due just to time and funding constraints. And so we narrowed it down to 12 focal habitats, which you can see are listed here in the middle. And where we could in the assessment, we integrated ecosystem services that are associated with those habitats and called out some of the keystone species that are also associated with those habitats. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Whitney to talk about the vulnerability assessment and to walk you through some of the products that have been created. And you'll have to hold on for just a moment. It takes a second for her to get control of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Jessie. Okay, so after identifying the focal habitats, our next step was to conduct a vulnerability assessment. So vulnerability assessments are really useful tools because they allow us to not only identify which focal resources are most vulnerable to climate change, but why they're vulnerable. So the way that EcoAdapt went through this particular process, let's see if I can forward the slides here. There we go. Okay. So the way that we went through this process is we engaged regional scientists, managers, and other stakeholders in Southern California in an online vulnerability assessment survey to evaluate resource vulnerabilities. Specifically, we had our experts look at habitat exposure to different climate changes, habitat sensitivity to those changes, so whether or not they'll actually exhibit some kind of response as the climate changes, and then habitat adaptive capacity, or a habitat's ability to respond or cope with different changes. Our experts provided both numeric and narrative vulnerability rankings. So the numeric scores allow us to compare vulnerability across habitats, while the narrative evaluations allow us to take a closer look at why it is resources are vulnerable and in which ways they are vulnerable. This information was then combined with a review of the scientific literature to form narrative vulnerability drafts, and these drafts are then recirculated back to experts and stakeholders for a peer review process. And many of you on the phone I know have seen these drafts, so thank you for your work in that cycle. So as I mentioned, one benefit of vulnerability assessments is they allow us to see which habitats are most vulnerable. So here I have summarized the relative vulnerability rankings for our different habitats as we went through this assessment. You can see that there's a range of final vulnerability rankings from moderate high vulnerability for two of our habitats, pinyon juniper and alluvial scrub, all the way down to low moderate vulnerability for several others, including subalpine, oak woodland, and chaparral. So although it's ideal to learn about which habitats are most vulnerable, some of the other takeaways from these overall scores, are to look at the confidence evaluations. We had our habitat experts evaluate their confidence in the different components of vulnerability and rankings that they provided. And so for habitats where there's a high confidence score in their final vulnerability ranking, we can be fairly certain, or at least more certain, in how these habitats will respond to change. So as you begin to think about adaptation, you can maybe focus on targeting the vulnerabilities that are identified in the assessment when you are implementing adaptation strategies. But for those habitats that have a moderate or lower vulnerability ranking, you may want to be a little bit more conservative because based on our expert opinion, we're not entirely sure how the habitat may respond, and so you may want to prioritize no regrets adaptation strategies, or strategies that we're fairly sure will at least bolster overall habitat health, such as reducing non-climate stressors. Okay. So another way to look at the overall results from this assessment are to compare the different components of vulnerability. And this starts to get more at the why a habitat is vulnerable to climate change. So here we have habitat vulnerability plotted based on a habitat sensitivity and exposure, and then on its adaptive capacity. So one of the big takeaways here that I want to highlight is that the top ranked, or the most vulnerable habitats that are appearing near the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, these are actually a different subset of habitats that appeared on the last slide. And the reason why it appears differently in this view is that we're looking at components of vulnerability rather than overall scores. So here we see that desert habitats actually emerge as being one of the most vulnerable, and this is largely being driven by their moderate high sensitivity and exposure to climate change and a low moderate ability to adapt to those changes. So this just gives us more information when we start to think about what adaptation strategies we want to use. In terms of what information is available for each habitat that went through this assessment, there's this type of information for every single one. You'll be able to look at the overall vulnerability rankings and confidence scores, and then there's subcomponent evaluations and information explaining what factors are driving that overall ranking. So you'll be able to see that for a habitat like alluvial scrub, there is high exposure to a variety of different climate changes, and more concerning is that the habitat is sensitive to those particular changes. Some of those drivers really affect habitat composition, distribution, and function, and so as climate change progresses, we're likely to see impacts in the habitat. We've also highlighted different adaptive capacity factors, including factors that impair the ability of the habitat to adapt to climate change. So for example, if it's restricted on the landscape or in a degraded condition, and then also factors that help bolster habitat resilience to climate change or its ability to deal with impacts, such as if it's a disturbance adapted community or there's high management focus on this area already. So now I'd like to take a look at some of the products that have come out of this particular process. And in this project, we developed a suite of 3 different vulnerability products that can help meet your management needs. So as I review these products, just some questions for yourself to keep in mind are, what type of information do I need and what level of information do I need? Because based on the answers to those questions, some of our products are probably better suited to you than others. So the first product that came out of this vulnerability assessment process, we are calling vulnerability syntheses. And these are in-depth looks at habitat vulnerability information. So they're quite long, they're 15+ pages in most cases, and they're presented in a narrative format. So typically the information is, the key vulnerabilities are summarized at the beginning of each section, and then different drivers are discussed in detail. And the detailed discussions include summaries of overall and potential impacts, where possible subgeographic and species level examples, and then also comparisons of where there may be conflicting information in the literature or amongst expert opinion, and where there are potential knowledge gaps. So there are a variety of ways that this type of synthesis can be used in your day-to-day work. In the case of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, they actually took information directly from some of these vulnerability syntheses and inserted it directly into their forest plan assessment and revision. Additionally, because of the in-depth discussions that look at potential conflicting information or information gaps, these syntheses can be really useful in identifying where to target monitoring or additional research in order to help bolster our confidence in how we think habitats are likely to respond to change. If that information seems way too in-depth or way more than you need, we've also developed vulnerability summaries. So this is the same information that occurs in the syntheses, but in a much more targeted format. So again, at the beginning of each section, there is a summary of all the different drivers, and then each driver is looked at in more detail in a table format and with bulleted impacts described on the right-hand side of each table. This is our first time debuting this specific product, and so we're really curious to hear feedback from you all if you think this is useful and how you're actually using it in your work. But one way that we've envisioned them being used is if you just need to get a preliminary view of vulnerability or understand what the key drivers for a given habitat are, you can go ahead and look at these summaries since they're much shorter, typically 5 to 9 pages. You can find the specific drivers and learn about overarching impacts. And then if you need more detail or subgeographic examples, you can turn to the corresponding section in the longer synthesis. Our last product is a vulnerability briefing, and we consider these to be more snapshots of vulnerability. So these are one-page documents where vulnerability information is summarized on the front, and on the back there is key adaptation information. So this takes all of the critical vulnerability information presented in the previous 2 products and condenses it down to 1 page. So it has all of the key vulnerabilities, a very broad description of general impacts, and it doesn't have any citations in the document. You'll have to refer back to the other documents to see those. But one way that this product has been used by past managers is when you receive public comments on a project, people have actually been able to point back at these documents to say, actually, we are considering climate change because these different stressors we're addressing throughout this project in these different ways. So it is a useful tool to at least be able to point out that you are considering key vulnerabilities and how you're applying them in your different project level actions. All right, now I'll turn it over to Laura to talk about how we've applied the vulnerability information that we got through this assessment in adaptation planning.
Laura, you should have control now.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Whitney. I'm good now.
Okay.
So we use the information from the vulnerability assessments during the next step of the process, which is climate change adaptation planning. Specifically, we want to look at the relative vulnerability of the focal habitats and consider which habitats are the most vulnerable and why. Then we identify adaptation strategies that attempt to reduce the negative impacts of climate change by either decreasing vulnerability or increasing resilience of the focal habitat. We can do that by addressing any or all of the three components of vulnerability, by reducing exposure and sensitivity, or enhancing adaptive capacity. Jesse, can you advance to the next slide for me?
Oh, I didn't do that. I think you did.
Oh, cool. Great. All right. Yeah, my arrows disappeared, but I'm good. All right. So for this project, we held the first of 2 adaptation workshops, and the purpose of the first workshop was to identify adaptation strategies that the Forest Service could implement to reduce the vulnerability of the focal habitat. So workshop participants formed small groups based on their expertise on the various focal habitats, and each group reviewed the vulnerability info and generated a suite of adaptation strategies that would fit within the context of their regional management goals. Each of the adaptation strategies included specific actions that could be implemented on the ground, as well as where, when, and how they should be applied so as to best reduce climate change vulnerability within that habitat. Then the participants evaluated the feasibility of implementing the strategy and how effective that strategy might be at reducing climate change vulnerability. And then for current actions or existing actions, participants discussed whether or not they should continue implementing the action and whether they might make any modifications to the action to reduce vulnerability further. All right. So to go over the products, we have 2 different products for the adaptation side of things. The first product we've called an adaptation synthesis, and that's available on the workshop webpage. And that's all of the information that we received from the participants in fairly raw form. So this table is one of those examples of what the participants gave us. So I'll point out at the top is a current management goal, which here is restoring disturbed areas, native species to prevent establishment of non-native species and to prevent erosion. Below the management goal, participants noted the potential climate vulnerabilities that might impact this goal, which here were reduced soil moisture, increased temperature, and reduced precipitation. The current management actions listed by the participants are in the left column, planting or seeding with native species, removing non-native species as soon as they're detected, and watering plants to ensure establishment. In the next 2 columns, participants rated the effectiveness of the actions at reducing the impacts of climate change and also the feasibility of implementing the actions. And they also noted whether the action would ameliorate any of the climate change vulnerabilities that they listed at the top. And then the next column to the right is called Continue to Implement Action. And here the participants considered whether it still makes sense to implement the action, given the expected climate changes and the vulnerability of the habitat to those changes. On this table, you can see that for the first 2 actions, the participants included that it does make sense to continue implementing those actions. But for the third one, they did not necessarily think that it made sense. Given drier conditions, watering plants may be more expensive, require more trips, that kind of thing. And then in the next column, where how to implement given climate vulnerabilities, the participants noted the ways that the current action could be modified to better address the climate vulnerabilities, such as planting native species in areas where soil moisture is higher, or looking into species that would be more tolerant of dry conditions. And then the last column ties those actions into the potential benefits of the conflicts that might come up during implementation. And this was a good way to identify places where this could tie into other goals, where collaboration with other agencies or organizations might be needed. All right. So the next product we have is the adaptation summary. And in this summary, we present that set of adaptation actions 3 different ways. This is the first of the 3, which is just a summary table of all the adaptation strategies that the participants came up with, as well as some additional strategies and actions that we found in the literature or from similar workshops that we've held. Here, the italicized actions are the ones that the participants came up with in this workshop. We divided the actions and strategies into 5 categories, which are enhance resistance, promote resilience, facilitate transition, increase knowledge, and engage coordination. So here is the same set of adaptation actions. In this case, we've listed the key vulnerability factors that affect alluvial scrub habitat. And then we linked them to the set of adaptation strategies and actions that were generated. So implementing the adaptation actions might help to reduce the impacts of these climate stressors, disturbance regimes, and non-climate stressors. In this table, the actions highlighted in red, enhance resistance, the actions in orange, promote resilience, and the actions in green, facilitate transition. So this table is useful. It allows you to quickly see which actions would address a particular vulnerability factor. So for instance, if you're worried about the impacts of air temperature, you could scan down through that column and see that 5 of the actions would address that vulnerability. Alternately, you can look at the table by row to identify which actions address multiple vulnerability factors, rather than just focusing on 1 or 2 impacts. For instance, restoring habitats of native species would decrease vulnerability to all of these factors, so that might be a good place to invest resources. So the last summarization of the set of adaptation actions allows us to visualize the relative effectiveness and feasibility of each action. So on this graph, on the x-axis along the bottom, we've placed the actions from low feasibility to high feasibility, and on the y-axis from low effectiveness to high effectiveness. Actions that are highly effective and highly feasible were in the upper right-hand corner, and these might be actions that you would want to implement first. And if you needed to make a decision about how to utilize limited resources, that these might be an action to prioritize. The next tier are actions that have been given 1 high and 1 moderate on either feasibility or effectiveness. So these would also be good bets. And then here are actions that had moderate feasibility or effectiveness, and so on. In the bottom right-hand corner, we would place actions that aren't considered feasible or effective. In the case of alluvial scrub, we didn't have any of those. But we did for some of the other habitats, and those would probably not make sense to put into place, at least initially. So again, all of these tables and graphs are available in the adaptation synthesis and the summary document on the workshop page. Okay, Jessie, thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so that was the first phase of the adaptation planning work that we were engaged in, and then we had a second phase, which was around developing adaptation implementation plans. And so this is where we held another workshop where participants worked on developing implementation plans for on-the-ground actions. So basically, how can we take this climate vulnerability and adaptation information and integrate it into what we're doing? And so the first activity that they worked on was to evaluate the vulnerabilities of and develop adaptation implementation plans for 4 specific management activities: fire and fuels management, grazing management, watershed improvement, and then restoration and planting. So I'm just going to show you what one of the products looks like, a sort of snapshot of this. So this is an example of an adaptation implementation action plan for fire and fuels management. So participants went through and thought about how current fire and fuels management activities may be vulnerable to climate change based on that information in the vulnerability assessment, and then developed specific adaptation strategies. And you can see here is one of the example strategies incorporating climate and fire vulnerability into fire management plans, and then updating fire management plans with climate and other stressor information. So that was the adaptation, one of the adaptation strategies that they identified for fire and fuels management. And then in order to put that adaptation strategy into practice, they developed out this implementation plan. And it's supposed to be implemented in a stepwise fashion. And then what you can see is that each number is sort of the next action that you would put into place in order to make sure that you implement this adaptation strategy. So what you can see is the first step is to just identify and map valued resources at risk, our most vulnerable sites, and our high value sites. So we need to be gathering this sort of fine scale spatial information so we can incorporate that into our fire management plans. And so this goes into a lot more detail in the products that are available on the website, but this just gives you sort of a snapshot of the sort of stepwise process that was developed for these different management activities and for these adaptation strategies. We also asked participants to identify specific challenges to implementation of the different steps in this implementation plan, and then what the solutions to those challenges might be. So for example, for the first step to identify and map valued resources at risk, the challenge right now is that we have a lack of fine-scale monitoring data and information, and that the solution is that we need to start collecting information on microsites and land facets as part of our long-term, large-scale monitoring program. Once we integrate that into our long-term monitoring programs, that's going to help us to identify these high-value sites, for example, these areas of climate refugia or connectivity, and it can potentially help to identify the more vulnerable sites. So in this implementation plan product that's available on the website, we do have these different challenges and solutions that have been identified as well for each of the steps. And there are implementation plans, again, for each of those 4 areas, so fire and fuels, grazing, watershed improvement, and restoration and planting. The other thing we asked participants to do as part of this particular workshop was to integrate climate change information into current forest projects. So we asked participants to, within groups, work on an ongoing or completed forest project and think about how vulnerability and adaptation information could be integrated into these kinds of projects going forward. And so we looked at 4 different on-the-ground projects. We looked at a chaparral field break project, a sage scrub restoration project, an aquatic organism passage project, and a grazing allotment project. And so I want to just take you through 2 of these sort of case studies showing how we integrate climate information into these projects. So the first case study project that we looked at was the Ojai Community Defense Zone project. It's a project that's been completed. The goal was to maintain existing field breaks and increase defensible space in order to reduce the threat of wildfire, to create safer conditions for the public and firefighters, to protect water quality, reduce the potential impacts of high-intensity wildfire, and then to increase the efficiency and cost effectiveness of fire suppression activities. And they had a number of different actions that were part of this particular project. It was things like managing ground cover, using irregular shapes in the field break design, expanding the width of the field break, and then using mechanical treatments. And so what we asked participants to think about was how climate change could affect the ability of the project to meet these goals that have been defined. So, how is climate change likely to affect our ability to create safer conditions or to protect water quality? And so some of the key climate vulnerabilities that were identified were things like increases in wildfire frequency and severity, increases in extreme precipitation events, and increases in invasive grasses. So if we have increased invasive grasses, that can lead to flashier fuels and even more fire. Increases in extreme precipitation events could lead to increases in erosion, particularly in field breaks where we have less vegetation, which is really going to make it difficult to protect water quality potentially. And then if we have increases in wildfire, it's going to make it more dangerous for firefighters, and it could potentially increase fire season. So it's going to make it really difficult in some cases to achieve some of these particular project goals. Then we asked participants to think about the current project actions, things like managing ground cover, and whether they reduce any of those vulnerabilities associated with climate change. Do they help address or reduce vulnerabilities associated with invasive grasses or precipitation events? And so for the first action, managing ground cover to result in a mixture of bare ground, native grasses, and forbs, yes, that helps to reduce issues with invasive grasses. It's going to help to, decrease potentially the potential for flashier fuels and increases in fire. If we use irregular shapes in field break design, that can help to reduce erosion potential if we have extreme precipitation events. If we have the irregular shapes in field break design, that helps to make sure that that sediment doesn't just slough off in a particular place, but actually is stopped by the vegetation in that irregular shape. And then if we expand the width of the field break, that can help to do things like increase the response speed or allow us to do some different tactics so we have less area burned overall. So even if we're going to see increases in wildfire, maybe having a wider field break allows us into areas we can do more and sort of limit how much gets burned. So in a lot of ways, current project actions do help to reduce some of the vulnerabilities that we've identified associated with climate change. But we also ask participants to consider new actions that could be added to further reduce vulnerabilities. And so some of the things that were recommended were things like adding to projects planting native perennial grasses within the field break, which helps to further limit invasive grasses. It helps to decrease flashy fire behavior associated with invasive grasses. Perennial grasses also help to increase water infiltration, which helps to reduce that erosion potential. So there's a lot of benefits potentially to incorporating planting of native perennial grasses into a fuel break project going forward. They also identified establishing trigger points for recreation closures and restrictions, which could help to reduce the likelihood of human-caused ignitions, but that would be another kind of action that would be really helpful to include in future fuel breaks projects because we're going to have, this increased potential for wildfire, and we really need to be limiting those chances for human-caused ignitions. And so these are just a couple of examples of things that people came up with, but we do have more that are available in some of the products. The second example or case study that I want to present from that workshop is for the Lower Puro Rangelands project. This is a grazing allotment project. They have a number of different project goals. You can see here on the left things like ensuring that livestock grazing is managed in a manner that moves toward desired resource conditions, mitigating livestock grazing impacts to threatened and endangered species habitats, making forage available to livestock operators, things like that. And so they have a number of actions that were part of this particular case study. It was things like grazing these 3 specific allotments, eliminating road and converting road to trail, reinstalling and repairing fencing in riparian areas, and then thinking about adjusting the season of use, stocking rate, or using temporary improvements to help influence livestock distribution. So when we thought about some of the key climate change vulnerabilities and how it could affect the ability of the project to meet these goals, some of the primary ones that were identified were things like increases in wildfire, increases in drought, increases in extreme precipitation events, and increased invasive grasses. And so things like increases in drought and invasive grasses are really going to impact the availability of forage. We have increases in extreme precipitation events that could affect our ability to mitigate grazing impacts by increasing erosion in riparian areas and also damaging fencing. And the same is true for increases in wildfire. So there's a number of different ways that climate vulnerabilities could potentially affect our ability to meet some of these project goals. So then when we looked at whether the current project actions help to reduce any vulnerabilities, if we do graze these 3 different allotments, it can help to reduce fire risk, potentially by decreasing fine fuel loads. Eliminating road and converting road to trail can help potentially to reduce erosion and sedimentation in riparian areas, particularly if it's next to a road. So if we do have those extreme precipitation events and if we have them following fire, that's when it can be really damaging in terms of erosion and sedimentation. Eliminating roads and converting road to trail can help also to reduce the likelihood of vehicle-caused ignitions. which may be even more of an issue in the future if we have things sort of coalescing towards this increase in wildfire frequency and severity. And then reinstalling and repairing fencing also helps to reduce erosion and sedimentation in riparian areas by, keeping livestock out of those particular places. So there's a number of different ways in which current project actions help to address these vulnerabilities. And then new actions that could be added are things like planting palatable and climate resilient native species, which can help to increase forage productivity and availability, promoting water infiltration and also reducing erosion risk. And then practicing invasive species management, also helping to limit invasive grasses and promoting desired plant species composition and forage availability for livestock operators. There's a lot of new actions that could also be added to grazing allotment types of projects moving forward that can help to reduce these vulnerabilities that could come as a result of climate change. So we have a whole series of products that feature this kind of information that I've just presented on, these different case studies. So this is what the product looks like for the Lower Superior Rangelands project, where we provide an overview. We talk about what the primary climate and non-climate vulnerabilities are, and then talk about how existing actions address those vulnerabilities and new actions that could be added. So we have 4 different case studies that are available on our project page. There's one for grazing, one for the fuel breaks project, another for an aquatic organism passage removal project, and then one for a sage scrub restoration project. And so we're hoping that these kinds of products sort of are a quick, easy way for you to see how this kind of vulnerability and adaptation information can be integrated into the kinds of things that you do very regularly. So I just really quickly want to touch on how this kind of information can be applied in management operations. We've sort of already touched on it throughout the presentation, but the climate adaptation products that have been created as part of this project, including the vulnerability assessment products and then the adaptation strategies and actions, can be applied to management operations in a number of different ways. And then in the right-hand column, these are just some of the places where they can be applied. For example, the vulnerability assessment can be used in forest planning, as Whitney mentioned. Another forest already used the kind of vulnerability assessment synthesis information in their forest plan assessment. Vulnerability assessment information can also be used in your existing condition NEPA analysis, and it can be used as the best available science for writing your purpose and need or potentially your project objectives. The adaptation strategies and actions can also be used in forest planning, for example, helping to articulate your desired conditions. It can also be used to help articulate the project purpose and need, and the adaptation actions can be used in project design and implementation. And then, although it's no longer relevant, it sounds like, both can be used to help address the climate scorecard. And if you want other examples, feel free to contact me. Again, this is Jessie Kirshner. I have other examples of how this information can be used or how other forests have used it. This is just meant to give you sort of a quick snapshot. And the last thing I wanted to mention is just that we do have some downscaled spatial climate information that is available for this particular project through Adaptation. If you're not familiar with Adaptation, it's a free online resource that houses spatial information, and you can look at different maps and data layers without having GIS. They have a map interface that you can use there. The website is there at the bottom. It's just databasin.org. But we have a project page there. So if you just search on their website for the Southern California Climate Adaptation Project, we have assembled a number of different downscaled climate data sets on here, as well as some non-climate data sets. For example, the BCM folder that's in here, this is the Basin Characterization Model, and we have downscaled data on here for things like temperature, precipitation, recharge, climatic water deficit that has been specifically generated for the Southern California geography. So you can access that information on Adaptation. And then again, if you can't find it by searching our project title, there's also a link here at the bottom of the presentation that you can access it through as well. So Just very quickly, these kinds of spatial climate tools and the maps that are available on there can help you to identify the projected climate changes for your region. So what do the downscaled projections look like for temperature, precipitation? It can help you to identify where and why your resources may be vulnerable, so you can overlay some of these projections with current distributions of some of your species to see, if they may be affected by some of these climate changes, and then also the magnitude of change that they're likely to experience. So we have just straight sort of what the projections look like for precipitation, in millimeters, but we also have the amount of change compared to historical conditions. So if we're likely to see, for example, a 20% decline in precipitation or a 10% increase, we have maps sort of showing the change in precipitation compared to historical conditions. So that's all available through that database insight as well. And with that, I'm trying to wrap it up fairly quickly so we have enough time left for questions. I would just like to thank the Forest Service and the California LCC for funding the project and also for being fantastic partners, and then the Conservation Biology Institute for bringing all of that spatial information together and putting it on Adaptation. And of course, thank you to all of the folks that participated in the project and participated in the workshops and reviewing the assessment results. We definitely couldn't have done it without you. And this link here in the dark blue box is just where you can find all of the products that are available on our project page. And hopefully it's clear, but if there's anything that you were curious about and you can't find, feel free to email us or contact us. And we have email addresses at the beginning of the presentation. And as I mentioned, we will be posting this presentation and we'll send you out a PDF also of it, but we'll be posting it on this website as well. So with that, I think I'll open it up for questions. And if you do have a question, remember you can write it in on the side in the question in your control panel. There should be a question box. And if you would rather, we can also call on you, so you can raise your hand, and we can just use the little raise hand button next to your name, and we can.
So this is Sarah. As we are waiting for questions, Jesse, just interrupt me if you see any coming in. I just wanted to give a couple more examples about how some of these products can be used. So the longer vulnerability assessments that Whitney spoke about are really fantastic science syntheses, and so in many instances they can save you from having to search for the primary literature. You can really just go into those for your particular habitat type where you are doing your project, and you can almost just copy and paste into a DEIS analysis. And if not, they can at least point you towards the primary literature that you might want to be looking for. And then in terms of some of the adaptation products, particularly the one that examines current actions that we often do and looks at it in a climate adaptation context and examines whether we would still want to do them or make some changes. If you're already heavily into a project, it would be a great time to just double check, is this something that we think we would still be doing in a climate change context? And if the answer is yes, which it is for most of them, you can then tie into your project the fact that you examined it in a climate change context, and that this is something that we still want to be doing, and that these are all the vulnerabilities that this current activity already addresses. And then finally, for those case studies, they're pretty broad in the types of projects that we do. And so if you are working on a fuel break project, for instance, it's another great way to examine what are the vulnerabilities that I'm already addressing with my project design, and really taking credit for that, and then referencing back to these documents that, look, these types of actions address these types of vulnerabilities, and that's exactly what we're proposing to do here. And then if you're in a place to consider modifying the project at all, those adaptation projects, all products also provide you some information on things you might think about adding or changing slightly within the project to address even more vulnerabilities. So I think there's just a ton of ways that they can be used, particularly in a project context, but also when you're thinking about, where are we going and what types of projects we want to do in the future.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And we don't have any questions so far. So we'll just wait another minute or two for folks. And if Whitney or Laura, is there anything else that you wanted to add or forgot to mention?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so. I know the case studies are designed in a way to where if you want to go through a similar process, you can do it quite quickly just by following the steps that are outlined in the different case studies. But overall, I think we covered all the really relevant information.
I'll just add one more thing then. Thanks to those who've joined the webinar. And we are giving another identical webinar next week in case you think other folks on your forest would like to join. But the other thing I would ask is that, we're often fairly bad at knowing what information already exists. And so if you can just share with a few people that these products do exist, they might not need them in their everyday lives. They might not tap into that for months to come, but there may come a time when they're involved in something and they'll say, hey, somebody told me that this product exists, and then they'll know where to find it. So just share that these exist for you guys. They're just an additional resource to try to help save you time and energy. And the more people that can know about them, the better.
And I would add that as you're looking through the products or you're thinking, sort of reflecting back on what we've presented on here today, if there are things that we could add in the future or you think would be particularly useful for project planning for us to try and address in the products moving forward, any sort of comments like that would be incredibly helpful for us, because we do try and revise these based on the feedback that we get from folks. And we do have a similar project that's kicking off in Northern California, and so the more useful that we can make these, the better. So if you just have a quick thought, you want to email us, that would be fantastic. Okay, well, it doesn't look like we have any questions. So I just want to reiterate what Sarah said, which is thank you so much for joining us. And we really appreciate you attending today. And if you do know of other folks that would be interested in listening, be sure to let them know that we'll have another one next week. And I will be sending out an email that will have a PDF of this particular presentation in it. And I'll include also a link to our project page so you can access all of the different products that are on there. But thank you, everybody, for joining us and taking the time to listen. We really appreciate it. Whitney, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay. I haven't checked to see how my recording went, but you check too and let me know.
Yeah, it looks like it's working on converting, so you should be able to end the webinar, and then it should just start auto-converting on your end.
Okay.
Sometimes it causes it to crash. It's really, I haven't found the perfect solution to it yet. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Good job.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yep.
And what was I was just going to ask you, oh no, never mind. I can ask you about it later. It was related to vulnerability stuff, but not for this. So,
okay.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thanks. I will end it now. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Bye.